afternoon. Thank you for coming. It's our last session of the day, so we're very grateful for those of you who can come. My name is Gracelyn Baskren. I'm the Research Director for Energy Security and Climate Change at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. I'm a mining economist. I was previously based in South Africa for 7 years, so I'm extremely interested in the idea of how do we turbocharge these economies that have historically not necessarily been on the economic main stage. We have a fantastic panel. I hope we get more people that sit down, by the way, but if we don't, we still have a fantastic panel. To my left is Frank Fannin, who is the Managing Director of Fannin Global Advisors. In a former life, he was the inaugural Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources. Brings a fantastic amount of experience, both in the US, but also working internationally. My middle seat, which is the best British perspective you'll ever have, is Charles Hendry. He's the former Minister of State for Energy in the UK. And to the far end on my left, but certainly not least, is Ernst Muller. He's a senior associate at Herbert Smith Freehills, where he is the point person responsible for ESG across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. And we actually started our careers both working on the Platinum Belt in South Africa, so I feel like I have 3 friends sitting here, which I'm really excited about. So again, as you'll see, the topic today is supercharging national economies across the super region. A big theme of this event is the mineral super region, and a lot of that spans countries that are relatively new and that the West and the Gulf have not had long-standing mining engagements with. There's been historic pushback against a traditional extractive model, so we're rethinking what that paradigm could look like. So I want to start out by asking our panelists, as we move away from a traditional extractive model, there's been a pushback against that. We see that through the rise in resource nationalism, for example. What does it take to create that new paradigm and ensure that these economies are benefiting, but still while mining companies are able to operate profitably? Frank.
Okay, thank you, and it's great to be here on the last panel. Firstly, I think that the concept of the super region itself is an interesting thing, because what the kingdom is, let's give credit where credit's due. The kingdom is the people who conceived of the concept. Really, we're defining a region not based on political boundaries, but by geologic formation. And these shields that are crossing, they cross countries. They don't respect the boundaries. So to consider the region as itself as a geologic region of exploration and exploitation, I think is a novel concept into itself. Second, I think you're exactly right, Gracelyn, in terms of these are countries that lack a history, or not a very long history, of modern mining. And so with that, I think that they have an opportunity to kind of approach this, adopt best practice. They can recognize poor legacy and not do that. They can choose to create the new modern mining really in whole cloth. But this beneficiation, how do they ensure that there's not just a shovel and ship kind of a model, but to create an economic ecosystem within this geologic super region, I think is profound, because you're talking about collective demand to create markets, because that's why it's being shipped elsewhere. How do we create markets and viability of that? And of course, these minerals are the foundation for economies. And as these economies scale, the mining component will be a part of that. So how do we keep that value here? I think first, it's demonstration of political will to do it. And I think clearly the kingdom is leading that. And I think that's been expressed many times. And by virtue of, what do we have, 60 countries that participate in the ministerial, clearly there's a consensus building of these new entrants that want to do that. Second, to attract the best kind of companies. Best companies tend to incorporate the best standards. By adopting those standards at the beginning, it'll entice the best to be here. And they'll have that kind of shared value concept of the industry. There's lots more I'd like to explore, but I'd like to hear from a British perspective.
That's fantastic. I think you touch on a lot of really good points there, and particularly how countries need to work together to enable the region to work together cohesively. Charles, I want to poke that question a little bit further for you. You're British, and a lot of the mining companies that would work in the super region are British. Most of the mining companies, even as an American, I can say they're not American. Our allies are London-based companies. So there's a real need for these companies, and sometimes these jurisdictions are higher risk for investors. So how do we ensure that these countries are benefiting, but that these companies are also able to operate and manage risk?
Yeah, so Grayson, thank you. It's my first time at the FMF, and I think it's been an amazingly good and impressive event. I think anybody who comes to this conference realize how serious Saudi Arabia is about this sector, about the level of ambition and the determination that they have to lead this. And so I think we should be very excited about what's happening. And the fact that the definition of a super region, Frank, in a way, because Saudi Arabia is at the heart of it, that makes it something of a super region. You only have to go back 50 years to when Saudi Arabia completely disrupted the oil industry, and where they quadrupled the price of oil. That sent shockwaves through the world, and it fundamentally tilted the balance between producers and the rest of the world, and the owners of the asset, of the people who had been the companies responsible for developing them. And I think we can see that something similar may happen here, because we have to rebalance the mining world. That the mining industry has a poor reputation. Often that is deserved, and often it isn't, but it has a poor reputation. And so the way it does business has to change, and the countries which are the hosts and whose resources are being developed and being often exported need to have a clearer benefit from what's happening in that. Now the UK, we're not part of that super region, but we do have a lot of skin in the game. We have some of the big mining companies headquartered in the UK. We are one of the world's leading centres for financing their activities. We're one of the leading centres for insuring them. We're one of the leading centres for all of the legal work which goes around it. And so if you're going to have a different approach, then actually those skill sets are going to be pretty relevant to how you make that happen. But at the end of the day, if we're going to make this transition to a low carbon world happen, you can only do that by much greater focus on mining, on a much broader range of mining activities, but it has to be done in a way that the host countries get a much better deal from it than they have in the past. They're sovereign countries. It's for them to decide how they want to do that, the nature of the relationships, the contracts that they offer, and we have to work with that. But we can help them to structure that in a way that actually makes it attractive to investors.
Can I just make one quick comment?
Of course you can.
I think just reflecting on your comments, I mean, I just think that it's such an amazing thing coming from the U.S. where we're arguing about constantly, for decades, permit streamlining. We say we want to do stuff, but no one's investing capital because there's not a real political will to realize what we say we want in practice. To come here and talk about the super region of all these countries who are saying, please come here, please, we're going to make it easy. It's such a contrast. It's such a contrast.
Absolutely, and I think, an observation from sitting in a little bit of a different chair is there's something that's very comfortable about the Gulf in a way, because it hasn't been pulled. I mean, we'll come to you in a second, but there has been this pressure, kind of political tug of war on the continent that's been playing out between Russia, China, and the U.S. So there's a neutrality and a comfort and an ease, an observation that I've had compared to other tables that I've sat at here. Ernst, I want to come to you. So you're South African, you've worked across the region, and we've seen in South Africa the effort to capture more and more of the benefits from a government point of view has put South Africa in the bottom 10 of attractive mining jurisdictions in the world, which is actually remarkable for a country that has $2.4 trillion of resources. So unfortunately, no offense, it's a sign of everything we shouldn't do. So how do how do we create signals of what we should do to ensure that countries in the mineral super region should attract that investment and not be South Africa?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Grace, and thanks for having me as well today. I'm pretty biased as a lawyer because I think every conversation should start with the law. But I also think that once you've spoken about the law, that's only the starting point, and then you need to look at the rest of the operating environment. I think the best way that you can send a signal to communities at large about how serious you are about mining is by creating a mining framework, a mineral law framework that gives rise to systems that are predictable, that are fair, that are transparent, and where governments act in an accountable manner. I do a lot of work in the ESG space, and really governance should start with governments. If we want to talk about everything that focuses on sustainability in the true sense of the word, it should start with the approach that governments take to running sectors. Now that could be the mining sector, which is the reason why we gathered here today, but it can be any other sector. It can be health, education, you name it. So I think learning from the South Africa example, it's very clear that mining companies invest in jurisdictions where they know what they're getting at the end of the day. We talk about the obsolescence bargaining model, which suggests that at the beginning of the mining life cycle, mining companies have the funds that are necessary to gain access to those resources which you will exploit. As soon as the mines are constructed, your asset is sunk and you're stuck. So the balance of power then shifts to government. And it's at that point in time that governments can really show how interested they are in developing sectors by giving mining companies the necessary comfort and support about how they will be allowed to extract the minerals, what is expected from them at the same time. But I think that's where the law starts, but also where the law stops. The next step that comes from that, also a lesson that we learn in Africa often, is that we operate in an ecosystem. And an ecosystem means that we are all participants in it, whether you are manufacturers, service suppliers of goods or services, communities, governments, banks. Everybody should be seen as participants in this sector, and again, the same onus that we place on governments, a necessity to act in an accountable and in a transparent manner, and a manner that gives rise to fairness and predictability. I think the same should be expected from all the participants in that conversation, because that, at the end of the day, I think will supercharge mineral development.
I think you hit on a lot of really important points there, but the legal framework is regularly cited as one of the biggest deterrents to doing business. Either the lack of a framework or a constantly changing framework, you know, and that's a challenge we face if you continue to revise it. You don't want to invest in there. Mining has a life of mine of 20 to 80 years. If you think it's going to change in 2 years, you're probably not going to dive in with the tens of millions of dollars of investment. I want to circle back. I'm going to pick on some of your answers. I'm going to start with Frank because he's sitting to my left. So, you know, I think you made a good point about, you know, minerals are divided by geology and not country borders. One of the biggest challenges we have, though, is getting neighboring countries to work together. If I look at something like even the African Continental Free Trade Area, commodities should move freely between regions, but that rarely happens. And this was kind of why the U.S. signed the tripartite agreement with the DRC and Zambia to create a regional value chain. Something someone recently told me from Zambia was it's unfortunate that the U.S. had to come to the table to help build that international cooperation agreement to allow those minerals and value addition to really build in the region. How do we facilitate more cooperation between countries? Because you can't build a processing facility in every country, right? It's not commercially viable. So I need to have kind of nodes or hubs. But how do we foster that collaboration?
Yeah, I think everyone's going to want it in their own country. I mean, it's the exact inverse of NIMBY, right? It's YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard. So how do we do that? I think some of the geography is going to help lend. I mean, someone who lacks a deep water port, they're not going to be perhaps not the best to be the processing hub, right? So some of that's going to be predetermined. But I think it's a broader question about how do we create the incentive structure for cooperation. I think the locations where there's going to be the giant elephant-sized deposits, it will be improbable to expect that they will want to have this sharing. But I think that most of those elephants have been found, and so the question is. By virtue of the fact that the energy transition is going to require 500, 600% increase in demand for certain metals, that it's going to open up new frontiers of exploration and exploitation, and those relationships. We talk about win-wins, but in this sense, they'll each have skin in the game to realize a better outcome for all. You can take instances of natural gas, for example. The development of the Eastern Mediterranean natural gas fields, where you have natural gas resources that they're so large and costly that they exceed the demand of the country off its shores. But by creating a regional market, you're creating a bigger pie. And so it makes it that exploitation of that resource economic. I see that as kind of a model. I don't think we have the appropriate frameworks yet. What I would be concerned about, my caution, is that it's not something that becomes a standard setting, or it becomes too strident in a legal kind of a framework. Sorry, but I think that we need to create a permissive system that creates that degree of encouragement. And you mentioned the agreement with the U.S., DRC, and Zambia. Perhaps that's we'll see what happens with that. But perhaps that could be a way to have this foster this kind of collaboration. But I think we're at the early stages of this energy transition. We're at the early stage of the ramp up, and we have to approach it that's as easy for adoption as possible, not create well-intentioned but effective barriers to that collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. It is very early, and I think even with the tripartite alliance, I mean, the idea was to attract the technical know-how and the capital, but it's slow. Progress is slow. We don't get overnight, the millions of dollars we need, and it can be frustrating for economies on the other end. But again, I mean, we're new territory in a way.
It's new.
Charles, I want to come to you. We talked a little bit about host countries needing to get the best deal. Again, we're in new territory. We're designing new instruments. I'm thinking about the U.S. We're designing critical minerals agreements. We're designing new things. From your point of view, again, London having long been a headquarter for many mining companies, if you had to pick the top one or two instruments for how to ensure that host countries get a good deal, what would they be? There's a lot, right? I mean, the Libido Corridor project is infrastructure, but if we think about, fiscal subsidies, community, increasing royalties, community support, workforce development, if you had to pick like one or two?
So I'm going to challenge a bit of the principle of your earlier question, because I don't think this is about collaboration. I think it's important that we do have common structures, but actually we want competition between different countries. We want them to be competing by saying we're going to have different tax rates, we're going to have different commitments to infrastructure investment to enable you to get your minerals out. And so we actually want to see them competing for that level of investment. We do, as Ernst says, need to have transparency, longevity, consistency, because these are investments which will last for 30, 40, 50 years, and without some degree of consistency and longevity, it's going to be very difficult to see how those investments come. But it's not for me in London to say to a country in sub-Saharan Africa, this is how you structure it. This is a sovereign decision that they must make and say, this is our country, it's our future. And they can say, we want to have higher taxes, and we're going to put that into education or whatever. Or they can say, we're going to expect you to do more on education or housing for the workforce, and we want them to be the drivers, because I want them to have ownership. I want them to really believe that this is something which can transform their countries and their economies and make this Africa's century. It should be Africa's century, because when you look at what needs to be done for the low carbon transition, Africa is at the heart of so much of that. And that therefore doing this in a way that they have the chance to set out their own framework is much better than me as a middle-aged white man, or not even middle-aged anymore, from North Europe saying this is how you should structure it.
So I'm going to push back a little bit. I agree with you completely. Like, countries need to have that sovereign autonomy. But something the U.S. is doing, right, domestically, is we are doing subsidies for workforce development on our side.
Fine.
My question is, should, like, the U.K. be deploying that to incentivize companies to do business overseas? Because that's something we're grappling with domestically, is if we're not getting our mines permitted in the U.S., should we be financially incentivizing them to reduce the cost of doing business abroad? Should the British government be providing incentives or encouraging companies to do specific things?
So there's a big British delegation here for this conference, and that shows that the UK government wants UK companies to be at the forefront of this work. But the model which will be adopted in each country has to be a sovereign model. And so that we can offer support through development aid, we can do support through education, support through infrastructure, just as the US has done so much wonderful work. But at the end of the day, we have to let those countries take the lead. And if they make the wrong choices, they won't get the investment. That's where I think this is transformative. If you look at oil and gas, two countries which are almost neighbors, Azerbaijan, which went down the route of PSAs, production sharing agreements, has had billions and billions of investment from international companies. Just across the Caspian, their neighbor Turkmenistan decided not to offer that, and they've had almost no international investment from the IOCs. You can see that being repeated in the mineral sector right across this super region, and that the countries, as I say, need to be incentivized by the opportunity this will bring them for advancement, for prosperity, for economic growth, to set the right policies and let them make that choices. We make mistakes, let them make mistakes. That's how we're going to progress and how we're going to bring about the best benefits for the people.
Absolutely, and that sovereign autonomy over resources is really important if you want to overcome the historical legacy of colonialism that we've seen a lot of pushback to in recent years. Ernst, I want to come to you. You're an ESG expert, and ESG has become kind of, I think 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was very much seen as a nice to have, and now it's a must have. It's, the center of commercial operations to ensure your social license to operate doesn't disappear. But when we look at ESG standards, some countries, they have standards in place, but a lot of the countries that have not historically received incentive may not have ESG standards in place already. So if I'm a foreign investor, because some of these countries don't have the domestic markets, so if I'm a foreign investor and the country I'm going to doesn't necessarily have clear standards in place, how do I go about navigating it to ensure that they are getting these benefits?
I think ESG raises a lot of interesting questions because it's such a hot topic at the moment, very, very politicized. But I like to take things back to first principles and just understand where it really comes from. Why do we talk about ESG in the first place? It's an American concept, I'll have you know, that started in the 70s when Lewis Powell wrote a memo to the chairman of the Education Committee at the Department of Commerce and said, if we want to think about the future viability, continued viability of the US enterprise, free US enterprise, we need to start thinking about non-financial factors that could have a material impact on the viability of the business models. And the examples that he mentions there focuses on labor force, it focuses on diversity and inclusion, focuses on environmental issues. Bear with me, I'm coming back to answer your question. So when we think about ESG and sustainability, it shouldn't be a stick. It shouldn't be a stick where businesses say, okay, we need to comply with the IFC's performance standards so we can get the money, so we can get this project up and running, so we can mine the cobalt, so we can export it, so we can build electric vehicles. When you think about ESG, ESG really is the part of business, not law, business, that focuses on viability. What do we need to do to keep the business up and running? If you want a business to run for 5 years, don't worry about ESG. You're going to waste your time. It's going to be too expensive. If you want a business to run for 50 years, for 100 years, start thinking about ESG factors. Call it what you want to. Depoliticize it. So coming back to your question, some countries don't necessarily have a lot of environmental, social, governance standards, whatever falls under that umbrella. That really shouldn't matter to your business model at the end of the day, because your business model should be, if I go into a specific region and I want to develop this asset, develop it over a 50, 60-year period so that I can really exploit the fantastic iron ore or copper ore that is located in this very difficult part of the Congo. What do I need to put in place from a systems perspective, taking into consideration environmental matters and social matters and governance matters, to ensure that we don't get caught with our pants down? Because that's, if we think about the ESG disasters that happened in the last 5 years, these are all instances where businesses didn't necessarily have all the systems and checks in place to gather the data at the right level to feed that through to the boards so that the boards get informed of what is happening so that they can prevent this risk from happening. So we talk about, not on the screen, but we spoke about risk earlier. Risk is always seen as a negative thing. Risk is not a negative thing. If you think about risk matrices, it's a positive or a negative thing depending on how you deal with it. The whole purpose of the new disclosure and reporting regime that we have globally through the IFRS's new ISSB 1 and 2 standards, and again with the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU region, supported by the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, is not about naming and shaming. It's about helping companies get to grips with the impact that they have on the environment, but again, that the environment has on them, and to ensure that they run business models and strategies that are informed by the data to give rise to a system that is viable. So that at the end of the day, we were speaking about, I think it was Charles, we were saying, it's a fantastic time for the mining sector because we have a massive amount of customers. Everybody wants access to critical minerals or green metals and minerals. So the customers are there. If you want to bake a cake, you need the flour, right? We need metals. We need to work together to ensure that we create mining sectors that can drive these systems. And you can do that by creating viable systems.
Absolutely. We only have a couple minutes left, so I want to just quickly whip through and ask each of you one more question. Frank, you have so much experience working in the U.S. government. People complain a lot in a lot of the countries in the mineral super region that America forgot to show up. How do we turn around that legacy? Because we can't make mining mutually beneficial if we're not showing up. What do we need to do to show up?
Well, I think we're starting to. I mean, in 2019, when I was leading some of these efforts in the U.S. government, I have internal discussions, and the question was, well, why are we talking about critical minerals? Why are you bringing this to my attention? That no one's asking that question. Now it's all about what are we doing about it. The question you just posed is the right one. So in a reasonably short period of time, I think our thinking has changed dramatically. In 2018, 2019, the Future Minerals Forum wasn't even a thought in anyone's head. And here we are at the third one, which is remarkable. It's remarkable because you see a disconnect between the ambition that we all have versus the time horizon to develop a mine. And so I think we are showing up. The question is whether the slow-moving way of the U.S. government works it needs to right size for the business environment. And that's the most important point here, to remind ourselves in the U.S. Government doesn't do it. The U.S. government does very little. The U.S. government can simply establish parameters and incentive structures. It's the private sector. It's private capital, it's capital formation, it's markets. They're the ones who make things happen. The shale revolution didn't happen because of government. The shale revolution happened because the private sector innovated, got after it, and here it changed the world. We can do that again with the mining industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the biggest challenge we face is like the state is not the investor in these economies, right? And I cannot force them to do something in the interest of security. We have 1 minute left, so I just want to quickly ask one more question to both of you. The UK has had a very active commercial diplomacy in the mining sector for quite a long time, in being able to engage in these various countries. Are there any countries that are at the top of your list in terms of where investors want to go?
So I'm not going to draw up a list, but I think that every country is in a position to be high on that list if it chooses to do so. But it requires a change in attitude in the countries which have the resources and how they go about allowing their resources to be developed, and also a change in attitude amongst the developed northern countries. That we cannot, that the tackle on climate change is the issue of our lives. It is the most important issue that we face, but we cannot win that battle by keeping 1 billion people in Africa poor. That the changes which have to happen have to bring widespread benefits to the countries which have the resources which are going to be fundamental to making that change happen. We in the West have no benefit from keeping Africa poor. We will have a much better world, and we will have a much better quality of living in Europe as well and in North America if Africa is a thriving, booming economy. So this is win-win. That we need those resources to assist that transition, but we need it to be done in a way that brings huge benefits to the countries.
I really appreciate the answer about not drawing up a list, because that's actually a perfect segue to my last question, which is I don't think that list can ever be a single list because of the nature of political changes and elections. So my last question is, there are 20 elections in Africa this year that we are all eyes on, because we know that elections can change laws, policies, frameworks, partners, transparency, permitting. What are you most looking at from a resource point of view with all of these elections happening? Are you worried about stability of mining policies?
Yes. Yes, I think one should always be conscious of that. Elections run in 5-year cycles, mining projects run in 30-year cycles. But again, if you have resilient processes in place, if you have a social license in place, you will withstand election cycles, because politicians are as dependent on the electorate support as mining projects are on thriving.
Thank you. I loved all of your answers. Thank you for your insights. I think one of the things that I have found most fascinating, having recently moved to Washington, is that there's not a lot of areas that are bipartisan, but international cooperation on mining is, because you can only mine what you have under your feet. And I mean, we don't have everything underground. The UK doesn't have everything underground. Saudi doesn't have everything. South Africa does. So it really brings together the international arena, and I think it's been a fantastic part of this event over the last 2 days. So thank you for joining us. We appreciate you joining the last event of the day. Have a fantastic day.